This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship,
about engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues
and how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. This week we're going to discuss recent and historical events in Brazil, which is, many of our listeners know, the largest country in South America, but a country that is largely unknown to many Americans, yet a country that's been in the news quite a lot recently with a recent election, a very close election, and recent violence that in some ways seems to mirror, at least it seems to mirror, the violence of January 6th in the United States, where a candidate who lost the election, his supporters, in this case, former President Bolsonaro's supporters, attempted, it appears, to stop the new government from functioning in Brazil, or at least appeared to try to express their anger through violence in ways that did seem to echo January 6th in the United States. We're not going to just focus on the present today, however. We're going to look, as we do every week, at how the history of Brazil helps us to better understand and make sense of what we're seeing today. We're joined by my colleague and friend, Seth Garfield, who is one of the foremost historians of Brazil in the United States today. Seth is a professor of history here at the University of Texas at Austin, and he's the author of 3 major books, among many articles and various other things. His first book, Indigenous Struggle at the Heart of Brazil, State Policy, Frontier Expansion, and the Havante Indians, I hope I pronounced that right, 1937 to 1988. His second book, with a wonderful title, In Search of the Amazon, Brazil, the United States, and the Nature of a Region. And then his third book, which I think picks up on some of Seth's writing on commodity issues, is most recently published, hot off the presses, Guarana, How Brazil Embraced the World's Most Caffeine-Rich Plant. And the idea of a caffeine-rich plant at 5 o'clock sounds actually quite enticing right now, I have to say. Seth, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on the podcast, Jeremy. It's really a pleasure.
Before we turn to our discussion with Professor Garfield, of course, we have Zachary Suri's scene-setting poem. What is the title of your poem this week, Zachary?
Brazilia Lament.
Let's hear it.
As I sat with a coffee in the public square, I basked in the memory of somewhere, a place where grass was shining green at dawn. We watched the stars float by on the cool lawn. I believe it was then that you said to me that all our words are buzzes from a single bee. It stings to think the world has never changed and the ghostly myth of violence forever remains. As I woke up this morning, I wanted pictures on the wall that would make me remember our world before it all, where in my child dreams the giants pranced, the fortune tellers whispered, and the quiet soldiers danced. Wake up, I think I hear them say, you will see this history again someday. Why we didn't listen, why we didn't care, I do not care to think it was either here or there. We watched it and we gasped. We watched the world collapse. How mightily intrusive, how principally unfair. Sir, may I have an orange juice, or perhaps a dare? Beware, our words are what only beggars seem to find. A vengeance on the cruel, a pfennig for the kind. Pens have moved mountains, they have swallowed swords, and again erected reasoning for their ghastly wars. And yet, though we can see the world is rotten, we so clearly have forgotten, despite our 1,000 different popes that filled again with garbage hopes, our minds become but empty chalices. We go storming presidential palaces.
I love the crescendo there at the end, Zachary, and the references, which are all over the place. What is your poem about?
My poem is about the ways in which lies, like we saw in the aftermath of the Brazilian elections, how lies unchallenged can fester and cause violence very quickly, actually. and also how important it is actually to speak about democracy in a way that's meaningful, approachable, and accessible to people. A theme that I think is very relevant when we're talking about one of the largest democracies on earth.
Excellent, Zachary. Seth, as a historian, someone who's devoted much of your life to studying this country, how have you reacted to many of the issues Zachary references in his poem, the recent disorder, violence, uncertainty in Brazil?
Well, first I wanted to congratulate Zachary on that beautiful poem. I reacted the way many did, with just shock and sadness. To see a country whose democratic institutions are under siege, to see a recourse to violence, the repudiation of a fair election, and is heartbreaking and is frightening. And I think for those of us who study Brazil and who have a special cariño, as we say, or a tenderness for the country because of its culture and the warmth of its people, for the most part, to see this discord and to see this acrimoniousness in tearing a society apart has really been devastating.
And is this something you expected, Seth, or have you been surprised?
So this is a good question. Now, in retrospect, when I think about the dramatic transformations that Brazil, I think, has undergone over the last several decades since the return to democracy, which for those of us heralding or hoping for a more democratic and progressive Brazil, we're very heartened by these changes because Brazil made, I think, great strides in terms of creating a more progressive society, a more democratic society, challenging very deeply entrenched structures of patriarchy, of homophobia, of racism, of anti-indigenism. This all seemed very heartening, but of course, there were those in Brazil who thought otherwise and very much challenged, I believe, by these changes, by these transformations. And so this backlash, in some ways, is comprehensible in terms of their fear and their anger towards changes in society that threaten the status quo and upset the way the order or the hierarchies that long characterize the society.
It's something that's always fascinated me, Seth, and I come at this with so much ignorance. I've never actually visited Brazil and hope to some point. You should organize
It's
a trip
time
for
to
us,
do so, Jeremy. You have to get there.
I have every reason to want to. From everything I can tell, as you say, it's a warm party atmosphere, and I definitely want to be there. But from my ignorance, Seth, I mean, it strikes me that there's a contradiction, right? Brazil is such a diverse, multi-layered society, multiracial, filled with so much diversity of opinion and perspective that you can see even from the outside. But yet, for so long, it's had a right-wing repressive government. How do we make sense of that contradiction? I'm sure it's probably central to your scholarship in many ways.
Are you asking about the legacies of authoritarianism or the deeper roots of authoritarianism in Brazil?
Yes.
Yes. So this is an interesting question too, because I think that can be answered on various levels. I think in terms of its formal politics, Brazil's democratic traditions are quite young. I mean, in the longer history of Brazil, you have a period from 1946 to 64, prior to the military coup, where you did have a multi-party democracy that with competitive free and fair elections, et cetera. But as we know, which culminated in the military coup, in no small part, in response to some of the progressive policies that the left of center governments in the 1960s were trying to enact. Then, after the return to democracy in 1985 and the Constitution of 1988, you've had a long spell, almost 40 years basically, of a strengthening of civil society, of free and fair elections, of progressive policies that, as I said before, that challenge many of the traditional hierarchies. So that's sort of the formal, macro-political, I would say, overview. But on a broader level, on a broader cultural level, I guess you could say, in Brazil, like in most countries, I think there have always been different factions, some more progressive, some more reactionary. And in some ways, looking back over the longue durée over many centuries of Brazilian history, there were always sectors in society that advocated for better treatment for indigenous peoples during the colonial period, or for the abolition of slavery in the 19th century, or for women's suffrage in the 20th century, who were up against more conservative groups and faced backlash for these attempts at democratizing Brazilian society. So that maybe can give a broader overview in which we can place, I think, this more recent swing to the right under the presidency of Bolsonaro, and the lingering kind of resentment that culminated in that violent insurrection in the beginning of January in Brasilia.
Could you maybe, for our American listeners, which I think make up a large portion of our listenership, though not exclusively American, could you explain maybe the relationship historically, not just between the government of the United States and the government of Brazil, but between the political movements and the political trends, social trends as well, between Brazil and the United States? You'd think, just looking at a map, that they'd probably be quite closely connected.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There's been a lot of historical scholarship that's been done recently that's focused on connections between Brazil and the United States during the 19th century. And there you see right-wing influence and more progressive influence. You have efforts on the part of slaveholders in the United States, on the southern states, as we know, to expand their influence, or in Latin America and in Brazil, because Brazil, after the abolition of slavery in the English colonies, Brazil, Cuba, and the United States are the sole slaveholding places. Since you have an empire, you have a republic, and you have a colony of Spain. So there were connections there, but there were also connections among abolitionists in the United States, or between abolition in the United States and Brazil. And I think these connections and these ties persist, of course, into the 20th and the 21st century. We know from some interesting scholarship that's been done on the far right and conservative religious movements in the United States and in Brazil, that there were close connections between these groups in terms of sharing ideas, publications, strategies, basically, to influence the political realm. So the two countries are often compared, Zachary, correctly, because they're not only because they're both the two largest countries of the Americas, and are both bear the legacy of slavery and racism and racial hierarchies, and are continental nations whose frontier expansion came at the great expense of indigenous peoples, but because you have shared connected movements that link the two countries in terms of their politics and their political orientation.
And it's worth reminding our listeners that Brazil is one of the few countries that maintains slavery, if I'm not mistaken, Seth, 3 decades after the end of the U.S. Civil War. Is that correct?
It's 1888, so it would be a little more than 2. Yes,
a little more than 2.
But
so
certainly, it
it
was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery.
And that was also a violent process, as it was in the United States, correct?
No, actually, it wasn't so much,
Okay.
and that's one of the that's one of the differences in terms of the way abolition was achieved. Towards the end of slavery, you did have enslaved peoples running away from the plantations, and their resistance certainly contributed to undermining slavery, which was already a sort of moribund institution in Brazil because of the way in which it was being gradually phased out through free womb laws and through other types of laws that were restricting slavery. And of course, the transatlantic slave trade, which was critical to the reproduction of slavery in Brazil, had been cut off since 1850, basically. But in the case of Brazil, the process was not as violent, certainly not as the United States, where you had a civil war. And in some ways, this reaffirmed in the minds of elites and conservatives this idea of a peaceful nation, a nation in which racial harmony and democracy was unique and exceptional, certainly from the United States, which has had its liabilities, of course, for Afro-descendant populations in Brazil, because they've come up against this idea that there is no racism in Brazil, or there is no racial discrimination. And in fact, just connecting this to more contemporary trends in Brazil, what I would say is since the early 2000s, you have affirmative action policies that are enacted by the left of center Workers' Party. And these did bring more Afro-Brazilians into universities. And this is one of the changes that I mentioned earlier on in the podcast, in ways in which transformations in Brazil's society over the last decades were noteworthy in empowering historically disempowered groups, but also produce a type of backlash as those in Brazil who felt disadvantaged by these changes or cheated, that in turn supported more right-wing governments that were critical of these progressive policies.
So, Seth, is that how you primarily see Bolsonaro and his movement, as a backlash against what in some ways were successful progressive changes?
I think there are a number of factors here. Bolsonaro had support for various reasons. I would say the most immediate or most sensationalist reason was, as you might know, this tremendous corruption scandal known as Operation Car Wash, which involved billions of dollars in graft and kickbacks, and brought down large segments of Brazil's political class, of its business class, and it discredited completely key aspects of the political system because the corruption was so rampant and so egregious. And Bolsonaro, in many ways, he cashed in on popular disgust that Brazilians felt to see this corruption running so rampant when basic public services were not being tended to, and poverty still afflicts large swaths of the population. So that was, a significant factor. He also played a great deal on the rise in crime and violence, particularly in Brazil's cities. Brazil's murder rate is 3 times as high as the United States. So it's a factor that primarily affects poor people in Brazil. But for the middle class, this is a significant concern. And he could play to a get tough on crime sort of approach. But I do think that these other changes that I mentioned earlier, in terms of more progressive policies that have been put into place regarding affirmative action, environmental protections that angered, large landowners and those linked to agribusiness, very stunning advances in terms, at least on paper, in terms of the creation of indigenous reserves and protection of indigenous lands, special protections that were extended to the descendants of runaway enslaved peoples, the legalization of same-sex marriage. All of this had happened or had been intensified, we could say, in the 2 decades prior to his election. And I do think that that was another source of his support. And of course, one thing I didn't touch on was the importance of the evangelical Christian vote in Brazil, which is also a product of transformation that has occurred in Brazil over the last half century, in which Brazil's Protestant and largely evangelical Protestant population or Pentecostal population has now ballooned to almost 30% of Brazil's overall population, and some say it will ultimately surpass the Catholic population of Brazil. And many of those voters tend to be conservative in their cultural politics, in their quote-unquote traditional values, and also in embracing more individualistic beliefs about hard work and capitalist work ethic and these types of ideas.
I have to ask, Seth, because it does seem, at least at the surface, to have a certain parallel with the United States. Why the growth of this evangelical movement over the last half century?
So this is connected to, there's a number of answers for that question as well. Part of it, I would say a lot of it has to do with the changes that were unleashed during the military government. So first of all, because the military government had a very conservative political and cultural agenda, and was certainly threatened by the progressive Catholic Church and liberation theology, they turned to evangelical leaders and right-wing Catholic leaders, actually, to support and legitimize their regime. And they rewarded these leaders and these communities, I guess you could say, by extending TV and radio licenses that gave evangelical leaders greater ability to disseminate their message far-flung across Brazil. So that's one factor. Also, under military rule, Brazil switches from being a predominantly rural nation to a predominantly urban nation. So more than 80%, it might even be more than 90% of Brazil's population at this point is urban. So you had a very rapid infusion of population from the countryside as people are coming to the cities looking for work in industry or in government. Many end up in service and informal economy, but you have an uprooted community in many ways. And this is also concomitant to this. You have a large migration to the Amazon region for those who are seeking, a better life on the frontier. But I think what these two large streams of migration have in common is you have a sort of uprooted communities or populations that are seeking to form new communities in urban areas. They're often terribly underserved by both the government as well as the Catholic Church in terms of social services. And you have evangelical churches moving in, providing these services, but also, giving people new ways to look at life, to look at theology, to look at questions of justice, and to make sense of the sort of wrenching changes that they've been through. And so I think all of these factors, and probably many more, contribute to this rapid spread. This is a process we know that's going on, globally in Africa as well. And this is also a process, getting back to your question, Zachary, in which evangelical groups in the United States have worked closely with those in Brazil in terms of sharing publications, conferences, leadership, this sort of global movement that has been very important, I think, in shifting the geopolitical scene internationally, as you have more conservative groups that are manifesting themselves in through political power and through political movements.
Speaking of big geopolitical problems that need to be solved, what role does environmentalism play in this? I think many Americans probably hear about Brazil in the context of the Amazon rainforest, and particularly in the Bolsonaro administration's decision to allow more deforestation. Where does the protection of the Amazon in particular, but also the sort of nascent conservationist movement of the past few decades, take place in this sort of political timeline you've lined out for?
That's a great question as well. Thank you. That also has its roots, I would say, in the military period, because under the military government between 1964 and 1985, the regime made a very concerted push to develop the Amazon as a geopolitical project. There were many factors. There was a sense that the wealth of the Amazon, mineral or other types of agricultural ranching, et cetera, could certainly contribute to the development in Brazil. But there was also this sort of paranoia that if the region were left quote unquote undeveloped or less populated, that it could be seized by other countries or invaded. This had been a longstanding fear among Brazilian military officials and nationalists. There was also an effort to relocate poorer populations from the more settled the more historically longer settled regions of Brazil, at least by European and African descendant peoples, to move them to the Amazon and thereby diffuse land conflicts that had been festering throughout Brazil. So with that comes deforestation, because the military builds roads. One of the leading sources of deforestation, roads allowing for greater penetration by cattle ranchers, by loggers, etc., by settlers. So with that came a backlash and sort of an uproar over the accelerated rate of deforestation, which now reaches about 17% of the Amazon region, which is quite alarming. Many climate scientists speak of the Amazon reaching a so-called tipping point if this type of transformation of the ecosystems continue. But that environmental story, if we want to see some of the positive things that came out in the last decades, in many ways, during the 2000s, you had a reduction, especially under the presidency of Lula, of deforestation in the Amazon. You had more effective government agencies, environmental agencies that were overseeing or monitoring deforestation. You had greater reservation of indigenous areas. So there was a very concerted effort to set aside land for environmental purposes, for indigenous peoples, for the descendants of Afro-Brazilians. Under Bolsonaro, you had this odd and very eerie, certainly from a historian's perspective, resurrection of that 1960s, 1970s jingoistic rhetoric regarding the Amazon. It's not really a surprise because Bolsonaro was an open and very enthusiastic admirer of the military regime and often called for return of the military, a military takeover, and spoke very glowingly about the repression and the order that the military instituted during its 2 decades in ruling the country. But that language that the Amazon belongs to Brazil, that we have to, we're not going to let foreign environmentalists or anthropologists or Leonardo DiCaprio tell us how we should, this is our land. This is a question of national sovereignty, etc. This really got ramped up under Bolsonaro. And Bolsonaro did do a great deal of damage because it was not just the rhetoric. And the rhetoric certainly contributes to violence, as we know. But it also, what also characterized his government was the fact that these protections were rolled back. And most critically, the funding for many of these agencies that were instrumental in slowing deforestation was slashed. So there was a very conscious and concerted effort to eviscerate the agencies that had been and the agencies that had been empowered to reduce deforestation and to look after the traditional and the most vulnerable populations of the Amazon region. So under Lula, he's vowed to stop this. He's created a new Ministry for Indigenous Affairs. He's appointed Marina Silva, who's a very renowned and respected environmentalist and a former Minister of the Environment for Brazil, as his Minister of the Environment. So there's certainly an effort on the new government to try to reverse course. But many wonder, with all the damage that's been done, how effective the new regime will be in a sense.
And Seth, I'm so glad you brought up President Lula. I wanted to spend a little time talking about him as well. As I understand it, he's someone who comes out of the workers' movement, right, and labor activism and progressive politics in Brazil. He was president, as I'm sure most of our listeners know, and some might even remember. He was president from 2003 until 2010. And now he's come back to office, in a sense, to try to rescue, I guess, the left in Brazil. First of all, what is your reaction to that as a historian? And then where do you see this going?
Well, it's a stunning reversal of fortune for Lula, correct? One could argue that the story of Lula, his sort of triumphant return, it's quite remarkable. But in many ways, one could argue that he should not have been blocked from running for office to begin with, back, what would it have been, 2018. As part of that investigation to that massive corruption scandal, Lula himself was thrown into jail, but the conviction was ultimately thrown out because of the irregularities in which the presiding judge was communicating with the prosecutor, the way in which the case was tried. The evidence was seemingly very tendentious. So there's that, I guess, I would like to put, into the historical record, and many, those who are sympathetic or critical to what happened to Lula would point out. But I think his return also shows that Bolsonaro's government was so disastrous. I didn't talk about the 700,000 Brazilians who lost their lives to COVID because he was a COVID denialist and significantly hampered the public health measures that could have mitigated the impact of this pandemic. I think it's a testament that although Lula did score a very narrow victory, and Bolsonaro did obtain a frighteningly large number of votes in Brazil, it still was a victory, and it counted on the alliances that Lula was able to strike with other parties, including the center-right party, which during the 13 years that the Workers' Party was in office or held presidential office, was a fierce opponent of the Workers' Party. But now recognizing that they both had, the Bolsonaro far right prospect as a greater enemy, came together to defeat Bolsonaro.
And do you see this return of Lula to the presidency? Is it a return to the period he was in office before? Have we stepped back into that period, or do you see a different kind of Lula presidency emerging?
That's an excellent question. That's a tough question. Lula's presidency was one of great prosperity for Brazil. For Brazil in general, you had millions of people who were lifted out of poverty. You had a commodity boom in which, largely driven by imports or exports to China, in which Brazil's agribusiness really was thriving, and the country was in very good shape. This is when Brazil wins the option to host the Olympics, and everything's looking wonderful. Under his successor, Dilma Rousseff, those conditions would already change. China's economy is not doing too great now, so it's not clear. I think it's fair to say that the global conditions don't favor the current presidency of Lula as much as they did during his first two mandates. There's also the Bolsonaro factor, which, of course, during his presidency, you didn't have the eruption of this violent and virulent right-wing movement. And so it's unclear how that will play out over the course of his presidency. We saw some of the recourses to which the far right would resort in terms of that attack on January 8th in Brasilia. So one hopes that kind of will discredit sectors of that movement, but it probably will be a bit bumpy for Brazil as it will be for the United States over the next years.
What was striking to me, Seth, as someone watching the events in Brazil through the American media, of course, so I'm getting a filtered view, but what was striking to me were two things that I think have some historical precedent, right? One was what appeared to be the clash, not just between the Bolsonaro and the Lula supporters, but also between different levels of government. If I'm not mistaken, the local official in charge of the region around Brasilia is accused of not having responded quickly and was I think forced out of office by the Supreme Court justice. If I have that right.
Yes, I believe that's correct. Mm-hmm.
So the different levels of government fighting one another, and I think we often forget that Brazil, like the United States, is a federalist system. The other thing that was striking to me was how, in contrast to the past, in Brazil and other countries in Latin America, it did seem in this case, and I'm thinking of the contrast with Chile in particular, which is a case I know a little bit about, that the military was firmly on the side of the democratically elected government. That seems to be a little different from some of the history we've seen before. I wonder if you would comment on those two observations.
Yes, well, under Bolsonaro, you certainly had, in particular, the judicial system, the judiciary, that did speak out, that did attempt to rein in policies of Bolsonaro, power grabs, some of the authoritarian initiatives that he either encouraged or embraced, or some of the conspiracy theories that he hoped to advance in order to delegitimize Brazilian democracy and the electoral system in particular. You had pushback from the press too, as well, against this idea of fake news. So which of course is another transformation that occurs in Brazil over the last several decades. The explosion of social media and how that's affected or corrupted public discourse and civil discourse, etc. So that was the first question. The second question, refresh my memory. I'm sorry, Jeremy. What was the second question about?
Sure. So, yeah, sorry to throw so much at you, Seth, but you're so brilliant at making sense of this for us. The second question was about the military, right? Traditionally, those of us who are non-experts are always concerned, particularly, I have to say, in South America, about the military often being on the side of the coup plotters, not on defending democracy.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry, but I didn't remember that. Right. So the military did show restraint, which is very heartening. The coup plotters, one of their strategies prior to storming the Congress and the Supreme Court and the presidential palace in Brasilia was to camp out, as you I think referred to when you were talking about the governor of Brasilia allowing or not providing enough security that might have precluded that terrible attack. But these these right-wing supporters of Bolsonaro, camped out in front of the military barracks, basically encouraging or calling upon the military to intervene. So that was something that we know took place in 1964, there, prior to and leading up to the military coup that would last 21 years. In that, right-wing civilians, business people, the press, housewives, etc., were clamoring for the military to intervene, which they did, and that hasn't happened now. But as you know, and could tell us much more about, Jeremy, the ways in which democracy is under siege, under threat now globally, many have argued, is not so much from the hardcore military intervention, but the gradual but steady erosion of democratic processes and procedures and institutions. And I think Bolsonaro certainly did his damage and tried to wreak tremendous havoc on Brazil, on Brazilian institutions, through his conspiracy theories, through his fake news, and through his allegations and accusations, and through his policies and his budgetary decisions.
Right. And so we're not in the sense out of the woods yet. In fact, we might face a different kind of threat from what we faced in 1964, for example. So, Seth, you've elucidated so many complex issues for us. You've given us, I think, a whole course here in a few minutes, which is really phenomenal. We always like to close our discussions by showing or thinking a little bit about how this history can help us not to find a silver bullet solution going forward, but at least to be on a better pathway or come up with some better pathways moving forward. And I guess for many of our listeners who are in the United States or somehow connected to U.S. policymaking, I guess the question I wanted to close with you on is, what can and should the United States do to help, and what role can American citizens play in that?
Well, I think the Biden administration was very effective in immediately recognizing the results of the election in October, and thereby immediately legitimizing, throwing its weight behind Lula's victory. So this is important. I think that democratic and progressive groups in the United States have to and do work with partners in Brazil, whether it's environmental groups, indigenous groups, women's groups, LGBTQ groups, to ensure that the hard-fought and hard-won advances that these groups have made in Brazil are not eroded. If they have been lessened, that they're restored under the government of Lula. Democracy is fragile, and those of us who seek to preserve it need to be very vigilant about the ways in which, and proactive. We have to be vigilant and proactive in defending it and ensuring that those groups who seek to a more regressive, a less progressive, a more authoritarian, a more hierarchical type of society do not prevail, because there's certainly great strides that have been made on that front and that continue to be made on that front to roll back the advances that Brazilian society, I think, has achieved over the last few decades.
That's super helpful. Zachary, as a young person who cares deeply about democracy, and it's something we talk about every week, of course, on the podcast here, do you find that this discussion of events in Brazil, do you see it as opening optimistic pathways forward, or do you find it discouraging?
Well, I think that it's hard not to look at the past few years in the history of the Western Hemisphere and the history of the world and not be a little depressed by the political leadership we've had. But I do think that this year offers us an opportunity. Here we are in January to make a real difference. I think that what the elections in Brazil in the past year and in the United States 2 years ago show us is that voting and making our voices heard, even as individuals, can have a big difference, particularly in these close elections that seem to dominate world politics. And I think it's also important as a reminder that our challenges, the challenges we face at home in the United States, are not simply challenges that we face, but challenges that our neighbors face,
Right.
and challenges that we have a responsibility to solve or to help solve, not just at home, but abroad as well.
Right. And I think your comments
Excellent.
and Seth's insights really connect us to our theme from the very beginning of our podcast 4 years ago, right? It's Franklin Roosevelt talking about the next chapter of democracy in the 1930s, who reminds us that the United States is part of a global mosaic of democracies. And that means that we're connected to what happens in places like Brazil, but it also means that we can't strong arm our way into fixing these problems at home or abroad, that it's a more complex relationship. And I think Seth has really given us a broad historical understanding of the difficult choices and the long-term commitment. I think, as you put it, Seth, that's really, really important here. Seth Garfield, thank you so much for joining us and sharing so much insight with us. I think this was a classic case of how basic historical knowledge, or it's probably basic historical knowledge to you, can open up so many ways of thinking for those like myself, I have to admit, who are ignorant of that history.
Thank you, Jeremy. This was really a pleasure to have this opportunity. So I thank you for inviting me to be on your program. And thank you, Zachary, for those lovely and insightful words that you said at the end of the podcast. I certainly agree with all of your thoughts.
Thank you.
And thank you most of all to our loyal listeners for joining us for this week's episode of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harris Codini. Stay tuned for a new episode every week. You can find This Is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher.
See you next time.